right. Well, good morning, everybody. Appreciate you coming here to listen to me. I'm pretty happy to be able to give you this talk today about a topic which affects a lot of people in industry, and it's one of those things that if you don't pay attention to it, it can really come back to hurt you if you don't plan properly. One of the things which I think you'll notice a little bit throughout my presentation about my the things that I have to say about this or my background. Before coming to CRI as CTO, I was Chief Information Security Officer at Idaho National Laboratory here on the eastern side of the state. And before that, Chief Information Security Officer for the House of Representatives in DC. And I got to have the opportunity to present very similar type of things to all of our congressmen and congresswomen and senators, especially when they would start new sessions of Congress. And so that it was always interesting to hear some of their questions because they get targeted quite a bit. And then before that, for about 8 years, which is actually what gives me a unique perspective on this stuff, is I worked for Central Intelligence Agency as Staff Operations Officer. I worked in counterterrorism, counterintelligence, and then I also worked in information operations. So what that essentially means is that I was doing this stuff for real, not necessarily ransomware, but developing malware and deploying it, that kind of stuff, against other people. So by actually having done this stuff and being the bad guy in the eyes of other people, gives me a unique perspective on what it's really like to be a nation state and target other people. And so when translating that into defensive strategies, I try to think about what would I do to a business or an organization that I want to actually penetrate or affect, and what kinds of strategies would I want to employ, what's effective, what's not. So the three takeaways I would like for you to have today is to understand a little bit about the cost associated with this particular threat, the targeting, how you can become a target or be a target, and also some strategies for prevention. And what I'll do is walk through each of these, give you some high-level descriptions of some things that you can take back, and hopefully you walk away with a better understanding. The first thing is important to understand is to realize that ransomware and a lot of the attacks that occur out there when it comes to malware that you may see in the media, it's all about economics. It's all about money. And there's also a lot of psychology in there. Often when people see these things, they think, oh, hackers, and it's all very, very techy. But at the end of the day, this is a business. It's organized crime. That's what it is, just like Al Capone, except with a keyboard. And the difference, though, is that with this stuff, they can be located anywhere in the world and do it remotely. So there's a very low risk associated with launching these types of attacks. And then if only 1% of their efforts actually achieve success and bring in money, then they've achieved a lot of success. And so this is actually the reason I chose this topic to talk about today is it's been very successful. And we'll talk a little bit too about some of the other aspects of the economics behind this. But what a lot of these people do, the FBI and Secret Service, they track them down, as you can imagine. But a lot of these guys either live in countries which have no extradition, or they're in a country where the local police, even though we may have relationships with their government, their local police won't cooperate, and we may know exactly where they live, favorite color, favorite food, what their daily schedule is, but we can't go in and actually do anything about it. So, but law enforcement is very proactive when it comes to trying to find the larger networks, learn as much about this as they can, because it's fraud and extortion. So the business model is very simple. At the beginning, the malware which these bad guys create, it's got a few different components to it, and it's designed to, first of all, infect a computer on your network somehow, and then find the data that is on your machine or on a shared network drive. And when it finds that and it matches some code which is inside the malware, it will encrypt it, or it will rename it or encode it or something like that and make it inaccessible to you. And the next step, which is more the money-making part, is the attackers will send you some kind of notification, or it will be built into the malware itself. There'll be a message displayed on the screen saying, we have encrypted your files, and if you pay us X number of dollars, often in Bitcoin, although that's been changing to some of the other cryptocurrency, we will provide access to the data back to you. And then the other thing, which can also happen at the same time as these other things, is once the malware lands on your machine, it has capability to spread laterally throughout your network, or even send emails out, or capture your address book, your email address book, send that information out so your contacts can get all of these lovely messages, which from an infection perspective, they could be malicious links that you have to click on. They could be attachments that have malware built inside of them. And their main goal on the psychological side is to trick you into double-clicking on the attachment or going to the web page. Tremendously successful because this stuff is very sophisticated. It only takes one user to click on a link to infect their machine. If everyone in the environment has the same vulnerability that that user does, then they can all potentially get infected too. And I've worked some incident responses where up to 60, 80% of all the workstations in the environment, multiple locations, get compromised because, again, once the vulnerability is exploited, odds are it's going to be exploited in a lot of other machines as well. So this sort of goes round and round again when the emails go out from an expansion perspective to other people, or again, web links, they propagate, and it just continues. Sometimes the attackers will have an infrastructure themselves that they'll have campaigns where they send out massive amounts of emails to various people, and they just keep at it, millions and millions and millions of emails out. But again, it just takes one, and it just goes over and over again. So going to the first purpose of this talk, to understand a little bit about the cost, is I look at this from a business perspective, and for a couple reasons. One is it's probably what you're more interested in than just the actual hardcore techie aspect of it. But then also it goes back to cyber risk management and what decisions you may want to make to help protect yourself and your data against this stuff. So the most important thing up front is most people think that paying of the ransom is actually the biggest cost associated with these types of attacks. And while there can be some ransoms which are very, very high, they're actually, what they end up asking for is almost trivial. At its peak about 2 years ago, it was a little over $1,000. And now I think the average ransom is down to about $500, which is not very much, but it is something that if you pay that money, it goes into the attacker's bank account and they can just keep on attacking. When your systems go down, in my role as I was most recently, I didn't mention this earlier, deputy CIO at Idaho National Laboratory. And in the CIO role, when applications or systems are down and not functioning properly, of course there's a root cause behind that outage, but the first thing that I think about is what is the cost of this outage in terms of lost productivity? If enterprise email goes down, or the financial system goes down, or part of the network goes down, and you have 6,000 people twiddling their thumbs, that's a pretty big impact. And so measuring your system downtime in terms of lost productivity puts a different perspective on the cost associated with a lot of these things. You may have read in the paper, there are several local governments, schools, happens almost every day, businesses who have their files encrypted, and the average time that it brings them down, I believe it's about anywhere from 4 days to 10 days, depending on how good their backups are. And that's a long time to go without your data. And these other items here in this chart are all tied together and influence one another. So lost productivity, by far the largest impact if you factor in the hourly rate of idle workers. The response, if most likely your organization doesn't have the proper skills to respond to this type of thing, you can pay a lot of money, anywhere from $100K up to $1 million, sometimes even more than that, for security experts to come in and contain the situation, help you with the malware. And that's important because, like a lot of other attacks, you don't want to just address the machines that you see and then think that you're good, because you could just get reinfected again the next day. And so you want to understand, what is the vulnerability that was exploited in my environment, such that I can fix that and don't have to worry about this happening again. So that's the remediation piece. You go through and patch your systems. You do have to take machines offline, and just to make sure that they don't spread. And there's a whole process there. It happens very, very quickly, but again, you have to know what you're doing. The average, I want to say Homeland Security, they have a page on ransomware on their website. They put the average loss in terms of response and productivity at between 1 and 2 million for the average organization. Again, response can kind of be higher or lower depending. The remediation cost, kind of the same thing. For small and medium-sized businesses, the remediation cost is a little bit less. Downtime, if you're paying for subscriptions or cloud services, or you actually have customers who are dependent upon your systems for e-commerce transactions, that downtime, you're losing revenue. Those orders which you were counting on may not actually come in. You may never recover some of those. It's possible that some of those will queue, kind of depends on your system, but that represents a cost, which goes to reputation, reputation is hard to measure, of course, but any time that your system is down and your data is inaccessible, that's just never a good thing. If, for example, when I'm reading the news every day and I see an article about a news organization, or I see reports about a certain attack and what the company did to respond to it, I will remember that. If they say let's say the malware had been on their systems for 6 months, I'll think, okay, so that tells me a little bit about their monitoring, and I learn a lot about that organization. And then later on, let's say the company I'm working for wants to buy that particular solution. I'll recall back a little bit about the news article that I had seen and think, I don't know if the security is so good on this. Often people will ask my opinion, or other security professionals, about their opinion on certain products. Yeah, sometimes we go overboard and exaggerate the risk, hopefully not by a whole lot. That's something that we have to watch out for. But if you're trying to make a recommendation as to whether or not to buy a product, you don't want there to be a huge amount of doubt that you're communicating to the individual, because often that decision, when it comes to putting in software or hardware, that's a really big decision and can be very costly. It's your own reputation that you're putting on the line. And so when people ask me for my take on certain products, I always qualify it. I'll give a disclaimer as to why I say what I say. And then lastly, the ransom itself, to me, is actually the least important aspect of all of this from a cost perspective. Again, it can be $500, $1,000, something like that, which pales in comparison to all of these other things. It used to be just about 4 years or so ago, when you got infected with ransomware, you would get a little simple text message like this saying, hey, you were infected, pay up, and then it would give you instructions on how to do that. Not very pretty, just kind of boring. But again, what I was saying earlier is all of this stuff has a really large psychological component. So here, what they've done is, as new variants of malware come out, the writers have to be creative, and they come up with ways to differentiate themselves. So this one is an example of that, where the malware will, when it encrypts your files, it renames them with a .pennywise extension, just trying to be kind of funny. But the other thing which is different from the previous one is that this has a countdown clock associated with it. And this one warns you that if you don't pay the ransom within a certain period of time, that they're going to start deleting files. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But this is designed to pressure you into making some kind of decision quickly as to whether or not you're going to pay the ransom. So In this respect, it's very similar to a human hostage-taking type situation with a ransom. Usually they're pressuring you, and so this speeds up the transactions a little bit. And my wife suggested that I not tell you this joke, but I'll tell you anyway because I think it's great, which is, why does Hannibal Lecter not like clowns? It's because they taste funny. All right. Sorry, I just love that joke. So these guys are getting really creative when it comes to trying to brand their malware. This is Captain Kirk Ransomware. It's really amazing all of the different things that are out there. These guys are really creative. It's almost funny to look at if it weren't so sad in the sense that they're really impacting businesses here. One of the reasons which ransomware has been so successful is that over the last few years, if you look at the sophistication of malware in general across the spectrum, it's gotten more and more sophisticated. It's been easier to develop more fancy exploits which evade antivirus solutions or anti-malware solutions. They have what's called polymorphic malware, which will actually it'll go through different permutations of itself. It'll rewrite itself, its code, so that it will not actually get flagged as a scan. And there are a lot of different statistics out there. I grabbed this one about there being 75% of people get hit by this are running updated versions of their antivirus, which is true, but often they're not actually running the latest patches on their machine. Almost always one of the things which puts companies at risk is that they didn't patch for something which allowed the malware to come in and affect the machines. And often these patches are months old, sometimes even a year old. So it's important to keep on top of some of this stuff. And like anything else in the business world, going back to this being something of an economics discussion, when this started becoming really popular, there were a lot of other authors who flooded the market because they wanted in too. It's just like a business. And so you had all of these different malware writers flooding the market and coming in with different types of exploits, different brands, and just tons and tons and tons of them. And it was very hard for vendors to spot a lot of these. There are a lot of solutions out there which provide some level of protection against this, but at the end of the day, again, it only takes one of your machines, the right machine, to get compromised before your data can be inaccessible. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because I want to talk a little bit about where things are now, but when I mentioned economics, if you look back at 2016, 2017, that was really the huge growth curve when it comes to the market. You can see that the variants of malware greatly increased, the ransom actually greatly increased. And when it reached a certain point, a plateau, it started declining, the ransom started declining because, again, there are so many people out there. And so 2018, the average ransom for ransomware fell to a little bit north of 500. So what's actually happening now, which happens and has happened in other cases with other types of malware, is that ransomware has been so effective at compromising organizations and using exploits to get into the systems that other malware writers with different intentions other than ransomware, they use the ransomware as a landing platform to get their stuff into the environment because the exploits are already built, it's already successful, already scares people, so why not? It's simple. Why reinvent the wheel if you don't have to, especially when it comes to writing program code? The other thing which these malware writers will do, besides just using ransomware as a cover for what they're doing, is they actually use it as a diversion tactic. When you're doing an incident response, you walk into an environment, an organization, company, government, you name it. The first thing you have to do is look at all of the things that are going on in the environment. What is happening which is not right, different? What are the different symptoms? Where are they occurring? What user accounts? And you have to get that full spectrum of perspective to understand what's going on. And so if somebody is getting into your environment and let's say they're running a large or they make you think that they're running a large ransomware campaign when in fact they couldn't care less about the ransomware. They're actually over here doing something else. Well, they've achieved their goal. And so this is something that a lot of reports you may see about some of the security research that's coming out for this particular year. One of the things which is really hot right now is crypto mining. You may think that there's ransomware being dropped on your machine, but it's actually a crypto miner, which actually will use the resources on your machine to mine, not so much Bitcoin these days, but mine digital currency. And you wouldn't be any the wiser. When responding to these things yourself, short of spending $1 million for a whole team of people, it's important for you to understand some prevention techniques that you need to apply in order to try to minimize your risk here. It's very important to have the right set of tools. And it's really amazing how many organizations out there don't have some of the basic things that they have in place, which I can understand as a business person or a technology professional. You've got a lot of other things going on, and it's one of the things that you're just not worried about often until it actually hits you. But this is something, and again, it's the reason why I chose this topic, is that it happens so much and have affected so many organizations that the odds are extremely high that multiple people here at this event will get this if they haven't already. So the first thing up top from a tip perspective is to consider yourself to be a target. I always hear this. People will say, well, I don't have anything of interest. And when it comes to ransomware, it may be true in terms of the content of the information, but if they render your data as inaccessible, it's going to most likely impact your business. These days, every technology or every organization is a technology organization, whether it be how they run their internal systems, how they interface with customers. It's very important to have those things up. So if your data is not accessible, it's going to impact your business most likely. And so you really are a target. And I like to say that if you don't think you're a target, you're actually the perfect target, because odds are you haven't gone through and done a lot of these things. The second thing, which is equally important, is to have a plan. Actually think through this topic. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a 500-page document which describes everything that you're going to do, but think through. Do some research, or have some people on your team do some research, look at some best practices and some strategies for planning purposes. Do you know actually what you would do if something like this hits your environment? If your backups got encrypted? Staying on top of the capabilities of the current malware out there is important, because if that changes, which it does every now and then, you may need to change your plan in terms of how you respond and the types of controls that you're going to apply to your organization. So having a plan is just critical. Of course, there is the question, do you pay the ransom or not? And I would highly recommend against that for multiple reasons. One is that you perpetuate the problem, because the only reason, again, this happens is an economic reason. It's successful. And you're contributing to that. Some organizations who are just looking at their own business, evaluate the cost of the ransom, which is $500, whatever, $1,000, versus the cost that's being incurred by the lost productivity and downtime, and think, well, if I just go ahead and pay this, I'll get my files back and all is good. Well, looking at the bottom one here, the statistic, I believe it's about anywhere from 5 to 20%, depending on what you look at. That's the percentage of success you will have if you actually pay the ransom. Paying the ransom is no guarantee that you will get your files back. They may just take your money and run. But kind of like a cold or something like that, if you think about how fast colds and flu spread, if every time you got one it killed you, it's not a very effective virus, because it's not going to live long enough to spread to somebody else. Well, in the case of ransomware, it's kind of the same thing. To keep the fear up and to keep people paying, they do have to actually release files. So some people will do it, others will not. I've seen cases where this ransomware uses sophisticated encryption algorithms. Other cases, all it does is simply rename the files, doesn't encrypt them or anything. And so if you know that, you certainly don't want to be paying the ransom if you can actually see your files and just rename them back. Inadequate backups making sure that you know where your data is and that if by chance you have your data encrypted by something like this, you know how to get the data back. And a colleague and I were talking yesterday a little bit about backups. Just like you would for disaster recovery or business continuity planning, backups are one of those things that you hear over and over and over again as a best practice. Make sure you back up your data again, again, again. Well, this is just yet another threat that you have to factor in when it comes to creating your backups. Often the malware, when it infects your machine, it'll also infect your backups if you don't actually have it designed properly, or if you don't have like a write once type media where you can't infect it once your data is already written in one case. So, and of course, in the middle here, again, going back to the psychological aspect of this, the education of your staff is probably the most important thing, because if it wasn't for them, the malware most likely wouldn't get into your environment. They're going to be clicking or opening that attachment because they can. And I have a cousin who is a pretty smart guy, and he knows that you're supposed to change the oil in your car every now and then. But I remember a few years ago, he didn't, and he tried to start his car one day, and it didn't start. There was just all sludge in there because he had gone like 2 or 3 years without changing his oil, and he had a make and model of a car that required a little bit more frequent change here. So it's good hygiene, it's good daily practice that prevents this stuff from occurring. And like any good defensive strategy, you do have other controls assisting the user, technical controls. But educating your staff on what this stuff is can just help your organization. So I talked a little bit about the importance of having a strategy. You want to make sure first, of course, that you do what you can to prevent this from happening. But if it does, that you have the ability to actually detect it before it becomes a big problem. If you can detect it and respond fairly soon after execution, then you're going to limit the damage that's caused to your environment. Since much, if not all of this malware, when it's being distributed, is via web links or email, malicious attachments, that kind of thing, making sure that you have good controls on your email security is very, very important. That's actually the very first place I would look, because that's the vector by which a lot of this stuff is coming in. Awareness, we talked about that. Endpoint security, I could talk for hours about that. There's a lot to talk about there because there's a lot of artificial intelligence and machine learning being built into current day solutions that can spot a lot of this stuff or proactively block it. But in some cases, it may proactively block it, but it doesn't clean it. You can't necessarily go in and contain. There are some solutions which can allow you to do that, but odds are if you're just running a single antivirus product, for example, you are woefully under-prepared. Backups, we talked about that. From a detection perspective, it's important to have capabilities which, if you have your whole organization compromised or versus just a couple, again, that you know how to respond to that. What is it that you're going to use from a technology perspective to identify that there's a problem before the message pops up on your screen saying that your data is encrypted? Because sometimes malware doesn't necessarily execute and spread right away. It may have a timer on it. It may sleep for a few days and then run to give it time to actually spread. It may spread and then run. So it's important to look at what your tool set is there. And from a response and recovery perspective, know how to do these things. Have your game plan together. Know how you're going to recover from something like this. Even something like communications to your customers. Again, what happens if your data is encrypted and your customers can't place orders or something like that? What are you going to tell them? If you're in a regulated environment like financial services or the health industry, you're going to have compliance requirements. What do? Who do you report this to? When do you report it? State privacy laws too. If the data, let's say that you get infected with some of this malware which encrypts PII. Well, even if the PII isn't necessarily exfiltrated, there are some states like California that require you to give notifications if the data is just accessed by an unauthorized party. And of course, I'm not an attorney when it comes to that, but there are a lot of different laws out there, GDPR in Europe, big on privacy. You have to think through all of these things. Just do it ahead of time, and that's really the main point of this talk. We talked about user before, and users, unlike people, you're never going to be able to manage this risk to zero. You just won't. But it is important to constantly look at it and do what you can from a reasonableness perspective. I mentioned at the beginning I would give talks similar to this to House of Representatives for new congressmen and women when they joined. And one of the things that we talk about are the threats that actually come in. And that environment's a little bit more complex because you actually have other aspects of threats like the human side and different things that you have to watch out for. But don't underestimate people, because if you put all of your time and effort into the technology, it's not going to solve the whole problem. You have to have this. I've seen multiple organizations that get infected by this stuff multiple times. And they may clean it or be successful, but they don't think that they need to do proper remediation, and so they may leave the file systems in place. Another variant of malware comes in and exploits the same vulnerability or something else. Well, you just got hit again. And if it happens to be a system that you didn't go back and clean up, there could be just files all over the place. It really becomes a mess. So it's understanding that once you get impacted by this, that you have to have a strategy for remediating your environment so that it doesn't happen again. I will be at CRI's booth all day, and feel free to come by and chat. We can talk about this stuff or malware in general, or CIA type stuff, shooting, jumping out of planes, that kind of thing. Lucas is going to be over here, and you can drop off your business card. If you like, there's going to be a drawing later today or tomorrow. I think we're still talking about when, for an organization-wide license, free for a year for Joinesty, which is a solution, an email privacy solution, which is interesting and protects some of the threats that we talked about today. And I believe an Apple Watch, is that right? So you can do that, and with that, I think I have about 10 minutes or so if you guys want to ask any questions.
Do you have any statistics on what percentage of attacks are actually ransomware as opposed to other forms of attacks?
Yeah, it actually changes and varies. I've seen different reports. One of the other very popular ones out there, besides the crypto mining and cryptojacking stuff, are banking Trojans. And those are really fun because those don't leave your data inaccessible. What they'll do is they'll scour your hard drive for any username and password that's on there, your contact list, and there is a person on the other end that will use that information to log into your personal accounts. If you start seeing your users call in or complain that their personal eBay or PayPal or Amazon accounts are getting compromised, odds are it's one of these things. Emotet, TrickBot are a couple of the most popular ones. And kind of interestingly, a very similar pattern is happening there as it is with ransomware, which is that some of the original, what I would call shell malware droppers, like Emotet, are being used as a way in for other types of malware. So often when you look at a machine, you can see all kinds of stuff out there. But that's also a really huge threat right now that has can have a big financial impact. We've definitely seen organizations that have been impacted by this, because again, the end goal is financial gain. But that's probably the other big one. Percentage-wise, again, it's interesting when you look at all of the threat reports, like the annual Verizon report or Symantec or McAfee or any of the vendors, even the cyber intelligence research companies. They all vary depending on what their techniques are for gathering information, and also the skills of the analyst that are analyzing the data, and what kind of review they have in place from a QA perspective. Because sometimes and this happens a lot. Media will write articles on some of this stuff, and the numbers are really just pulled out of thin air. Often that's one thing that happens. Or they'll reference a source, and you go to that source is referencing somebody else, and you go back to an article that doesn't really have much content. Everyone likes to reuse the statistics. So it's a long answer to your question, but I would say, this type of malware and the banking Trojans are the stuff that I would really keep an eye out for. They're very successful, and for those who are curious, if you looked at over the last few years, some of the exploits that have been used, there have been a lot of zero-day exploits which have been made public, whether they are NSAs or not. I'll leave for other people to talk about. Certain things I can't talk about, given my background, but all I can say is we are in a much different level of sophistication now than we were just 4 years or so ago. And part of the reason why ransomware and these banking Trojans are so prevalent is because of just that. They use those fancy exploits. I first started at agency in 2005. The cyber world was a little bit different then, and some of the capabilities which are out there now, there's a very clear distinction between organized crime, your little script kiddie, or someone doesn't necessarily have a programming ability or coding ability. Down here, organized crime, and the nation state. The lines are really all blurred now. And again, based on like open source information, you'll see media articles on North Korea writing something, malware capability, which may infect somebody. And another thing which has changed, bringing up North Korea, is that one of the shells, once malware gets into your environment, having routines which can actually just wipe all of your data is something that is becoming more popular. It's happened to certain countries, or countries, governments, organizations that are out there. You can read about that. And the purpose of that is just destruction. Just last week on Tuesday, there was a company called V-Email, I believe, and this was, I forget the owner's name, but it's a private email service designed to provide secure email access to its customers. Had been in business for a while. Well, Tuesday rolls around, and again, this just happened last week. An attacker got in, wiped his entire infrastructure, all of his data, customer data, backups, and if you go to his Twitter site, you could actually look this up. I feel bad for the guy. He's basically not going to recover. His business is gone, and he acknowledges that. And he said there's a quote that, I can't imagine why somebody would want to do this to me, et cetera, et cetera. And my response to that is because they can. There are people out there, it's kind of like, why do you climb a mountain? Well, because you can, because you like to climb. There are people out there who, even though they may not target you specifically, like you as a named individual, if you represent a target, a challenge, and they can exploit that, it's something that they may actually do. Those types of people, I would say, are a little more rare for a couple reasons. One is often it requires a little bit more technical capability to get in and actually run that type of thing. But second, you're committing a rather large crime doing something like that. If the company reports to law enforcement, hopefully they do, the FBI are going to be all over you. And I would not want to take that risk. It's one of the things which any of you are or work with FBI, they have really good relationships with law enforcement all over the planet, much more than you might think. And they're really good at tracking these people down. So if somebody actually does this, they better be prepared to be hunted for a good while. Yeah, does that answer your question? It's okay. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Are there some OSs less susceptible than others in this regard?
Yes, I should have touched on that. It's a very common, I would say it's a belief, but it's actually true that if from again, economics perspective, the Windows operating system has a majority of the market share. Mac OS, I want to say it's 20 to 30%. That's just more of a guess than anything else, but I know it's kind of sub 33% penetration. So they're going to go where the money is. What do most people have deployed in an enterprise environment? Windows, most likely. And a lot of reasons for that I won't really go into. So Macs are not quite as deployed as Windows machines. There is Mac malware out there. A good friend of mine, Andrew Case, is a core developer for the volatility memory analysis tool. And just known him for years and worked with him a little bit. But they actually coded an add-on for analyzing Mac memory, specifically because the use cases started increasing. There is Mac malware out there. There actually is some Mac ransomware that's out there. And so not putting solutions on your Mac, for example, and just thinking that because it's a Mac, it's safe, it's not necessarily the case. There are a lot of different types of malware out there for that. And again, this is a topic which is fun. I could talk about malware all day, like infecting mobile devices and IoT devices. But it's something that's out there. I would say it's pretty unlikely, although there are some things out there which affect Linux-like or Unix-like operating systems if you run that. Those are a little bit different. The tools to detect and respond to those are not quite as robust as the Windows OS. So all of the security vendors that are out there, they put the lion's share of their R&D into preventing and countering Windows-based threats, because again, it's economics. If you spend $1 billion developing perfect Mac malware solution, you may not necessarily get the return on investment that you're looking for. And haven't really gone through those numbers myself, but when I go and I talk to vendors, it's actually one of the questions I ask if it's a product vendor is, what operating systems do you support? And quite often there's a compliance component to that. You have to have protections for all of your OSs, Mac, Linux. If you do support Mac or Linux, what kind of performance impacts do you see when you actually run it? If you're running, like, let's say you have a file server where all of your data is, and you wanted to try to counter ransomware or something like that on the server, you'd want to put something on that computer that can detect, prevent an infection. Well, these types of things can be really intensive on your processor, on your disk. And so factoring that in is important too. Often if I do pen test or incident response, I use VMs that I can kind of blow away and recreate on a Mac OS. The reason why is because it is less likely to get compromised. I can work with Windows binaries or Windows programs without having to worry about infecting myself. Yeah, just more of a defensive strategy, because there's so many capabilities out there against Windows. And I shouldn't knock Windows necessarily, because Microsoft has done a really good job improving the security of its operating system. But even the best things that they've come out with have been countered. Things like signed certificates. If you're going to sign some malware, well, that's great, but the bad guys out there will just go and steal a valid certificate from someone else and then sign their malware. Well, they can then gain execution. So you can't necessarily rely on any one control. It really is an arms race, and the sophistication is just going to be growing more and more. And as businesses rely on technology more and more and put their data in more and more different places, again with cloud services, and they disperse it, the attackers, again, just economics. They're gonna go after your data. So you always have to be thinking about this. And there are a lot of different people who have philosophies and opinions on all this stuff and privacy implications and all that. And it's great. But again, all of this stuff comes down to the discussion about supply and demand. If somebody can get money out of you, they will. And there's really no argument, at least I don't think, that you could come up with which would prove that false. So this problem is going to be around a very, very long time. Any other questions? We have a few minutes. Sir?
You mentioned how a lot of these threat actors are in different countries, and I know that Russia is demoing shutting down its internet to the external world for a day or a week. Do you see that trend continuing in other countries? Or?
Let me think about that for a second. There's some things even though I don't work at its agency anymore, I'll get in trouble if I comment on it, just because of what I've done. That might be one of them. Let me think of a safe answer.
What's the question?
Sorry, I should repeat that. The question is, will we see continuation of nation-state attacks on others, like the example was Russia on Chinese infrastructure, on their internet infrastructure, taking it down, basically, or doing other types of things. And I would say the first thing I go back to, which I can talk about, is any intelligence agency out there, again, whether it's CIA or somebody else, they have collection requirements. So what they go after is basically what they're told to do, with some exceptions. There are other governments out there that don't necessarily play by the same rules we do. And so their agenda is different. Based on the things that you see in the news, and I'll leave it at that, I see that trend increasing. And that's actually what scares me, is that if you have the resources of a government behind you as a bad guy, you're going to be probably underprepared. And just in general, breaches and malware infections have happened to everybody. Equifax, you would think that the top 3 credit bureaus would have all of the top stuff, and they probably do. I know that there were some issues with their API that were causing that, which it's a whole different topic about application security, and secure coding practices. But it can happen to anybody. All of the banks. So you can throw $1 billion at this problem, might reduce your risk, 90%-ish. But as long as there's 5%, less than 5% risk out there, it's a concern. So with that, any other questions?
Given a lot of this activity is nation-state, foreigners attacking large quantities of U.S. citizens and businesses, what do you think it's going to take to finally get U.S. government, CIA, NSA, Cyber Command to actually start protecting the U.S. since it clearly is nation-state against the U.S.?
That's a really good question. And
What's the question?
I have to wrap up. Sorry. Just trying to think about my answer. Do you want to restate that?
Sure.
Or
Does this work?
please, I just want to make sure that we get.
No, it doesn't work. Did it work?
Yeah, it did at the end there.
So what do you think, given all this nation-state attacking against U.S. businesses and U.S. individuals, what will it finally take to get the U.S. government, NSA, Cyber Command, CIA, to start protecting the U.S. From these foreign governments and foreign activities?
Okay. I'll give a very brief answer before they kick me off the stage here. The brief answer is I actually know General Hayden, Michael Hayden. He was head of NSA and director of CIA. I just know him because he was director of CIA when I was there, and I had reason to talk to him because of counterintelligence reasons. But anyway, actually I had that same conversation with him, and he will go back to something which some people will disagree with, but it really comes to the government approach to how we view certain authorities. You can have certain authorities to allow certain types of activities, the authorization process it takes to go through and actually counter some of those threats. In some respects, we handcuff ourselves, and again, that's a whole other discussion. But I believe it really just comes down to the legal aspect of it, the laws that are out there, which exist, either granting authorities for certain things or what they allow or don't allow parts of the government to do. And it's kind of a hard conversation to have in an unclassified environment. But The problem's going to continue for a while because I don't see a whole lot of cyber-related legislation coming out of government these days. Okay, I think that is it. And thanks for being here and listening to me. And I think Lucas will be over there if you want to provide your business card for free drawing. And again, come by and feel free to say hi to me. I'll be here all day.
But that Chico nice. Y'all call it a moment.